Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Is this the live one? Yeah. Okay. I'll try and speak up. Okay, thanks for coming everyone, and I hope you'll find the talk tonight of interest. I'm not a biographer of Thomas Andrews, but I am going to cover just some details of his life, of his family, his work at Hand and Wolf, and his time on Olympic in particular in June of 1911. And of course, sadly, I'll touch upon Titanic in 1912 and his untimely demise. A lot of the notes that Thomas Andrews made are interesting, not just because of who was making the notes, but they also give us quite a good insight into Hand and Wolf and the White Star Line as well as the social norms of the time. So Thomas Andrews was born in 1873. Of course, by 1912, he just celebrated his 39th birthday. Oddly enough, he gave his age as 38 when he was on Titanic, so I don't know if he just wasn't used to being 39 or whether he'd decided to start dropping some years. The captain of the Titanic was 62, and yet he signed on and gave his age as 59. So if Andrews was starting to count down, he wouldn't have been alone. There is a lot of positive comment about Thomas Andrews. There was, of course, a family relationship with Lord Pirrie, with Hand and Wolf, and I think it's always a bit difficult because if there is that family relationship, there's maybe always that suspicion that you've got where you are because you're family rather than because of ability. But I think in Andrew's case, he was very skilled, and we have some quotes here from the biography that was published in 1912. Andrews left school and entered Hand and Wolf as a premium apprentice. He was chief of the design department in 1905, so he'd been 32. And then in 1907, he also became a managing director at Hand and Wolf. And then when Alexander Carlisle retired in June 1910, Andrews took over Carlisle's duties. Andrews was highly regarded not just at Hand and Wolf, but by the White Star Line. In April 1903, the White Star Line sent a cheque to Thomas Andrews for £200. So this was a sort of thank you bonus, and the company's shareholders had voted on it, and it was given to Andrews just as a recognition of thanks, of appreciation for all the work that he'd done, not just for Hand and Wolf, but also for White Star. Andrews married in 1908. He married a lady, Helen Riley, and their first child was born 2 years later. In political terms, it was said Andrews advocated moderate social reform on lines carefully designed to encourage thrift, temperance and endeavour. Rather sadly, both Andrews' father and mother outlived him. He had an older brother, John Miller Andrews, just 2 years older, who served as the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland from 1940 to 43. He had a younger brother, James Andrews, who became Lord Chief Justice in the late 1930s, and a younger brother, Willie Andrews, who was very accomplished in cricket. He also had a sister who unfortunately was widowed. Her husband, Lawrence, was killed in action at the Somme in 1916. Andrews' widow, Helen, remarried in 1917, and she married a man called Henry Harland, who I gather was basically a rival love interest. And of course, Thomas Andrews won over, and then he was sadly lost on Titanic. So I suppose the closest thing we're going to get to hearing Andrew's voice is to listen to his older brother. This is a short film clip, and apologies, we've got the volume as high as we can manage it. It's still a bit quiet, so hopefully you'll be able to hear it okay. And this was filmed in 1940 when he became Prime Minister, so it's a film of its time. But it's just nice to hear what his voice sounded like, and this is probably as close as we're going to get to imagining Andrew's voice. Turn this on.
In an interview with Global British News, Mr. Andrews expounded his straightforward policy.
Oh, sorry. Try again. Felt fine when we tested it.
In an interview with Global British News, Mr. Andrews expounded his straightforward policy.
Is the key to the defense of Ireland. To make it neutral would mean handing over that key to Hitler. A neutral Ulster is impossible. We mean to stand by Britain and the Empire.
And of course he passed away in 1956, which was only 2 years before the seminal film A Night to Remember was released. So it would have been interesting whether he'd have chosen, if he had still been living, to watch that. And if we fast forward to 1911, Olympic had been completed by Harland & Wolff. She was the largest ship in the world by quite a margin. You can see her here docked at Southampton. Thomas Andrews was one of a number of people from Harland & Wolff who were essentially a guarantee group. So they were there to keep an eye on the ship, to monitor her performance, rectify any minor errors, any minor things that might crop up. I don't know, a burst pipe, maybe some sort of fault in the heating system or something. They would have been on hand in order to sort it out. And Olympic was out Southampton for more than a week, preparing for her maiden voyage, and by all accounts Andrews was working very hard, wanted to make sure everything went without a hitch. We know that he was liaising with the British postal authorities on the 7th of June 1911, and as Olympic was a Royal Mail ship, the postal authorities were on board. They wanted to inspect the arrangements, the mail room, the quarters for the postal workers, just to see that everything had been built as planned. And Andrews explained to them there were some bag racks in the sorting room which were not ready. And he explained to them Harland & Wolff were making these at Southampton and that they'd fit them before sailing. So it seems to have been a bit of a rush job. And then Andrews had to have a bit of back and forth with the postal authorities, and he was saying, well, you know, this was all confirmed with your officials in prior correspondence, and the inspectors maybe hadn't quite realised that. So Andrews was aboard for the maiden voyage, and he wrote a whole series of notes. And this is the title directly from what Andrews wrote. It's rather frustrating, we don't have a complete set, and to my knowledge they're not available in any museum. It is believed that there are several duplicate copies, so potentially a personal copy for Andrews, and then reference copies for White Star, for Harland & Wolff. We now know that there were 56 notes that he made. He numbered each one individually, and we've got the final page, and you can tell that that's the end. So I've been able to assemble the majority, well, most of them I think. 28 to 39 and 47 to 55 are missing, and the ones that I have been able to put together has really been by the support of an awful lot, many other researchers. So with apologies in advance, because I know I'm going to forget some of them, but I need to thank Gunter, Bruce, Robin, Joao, Daniel, Bill, for either sharing copies that they've seen, sharing knowledge, and in some cases just helping me read Andrew's handwriting. Some of them have been published before. There was an article the early 2000s in the Titanic Historical Society's commutator by Ray Lepian about Olympic's maiden voyage. A very fine article, and he included some of the notes there as well. And just to give you an idea, so this is notes 10 to 14. Just gives you an idea of Andrew's handwriting. And unfortunately, I've only got one page. It was all I could afford. You know, memorabilia just seems to be a bit too ridiculous prices, and I was able to buy this page quite a number of years ago. But you just see Andrew's, he just writes it in detail. And I know there are people that do handwriting analysis. I often wonder what one of them might think, you know, if they analyse the handwriting, and if it didn't tell them whose handwriting it was, what would they say about Andrew's? I don't know. But Andrew's made a number of recommendations based on seeing Olympic. He thought the first class passenger gangway should have been attached to D deck rather than B deck, because he said, well, this is lower down, therefore it would be less demanding for passengers. So he was concerned about passenger comfort, and I guess he didn't want the first class passengers having to walk up too steep an incline, although only for a short period. And Andrews also made a recommendation about how the ship should be docked. In 1911, Olympic was docked at Southampton Bow first. It's an easy way to dock, but of course you then have to back out, which is not so easy. And Andrews said that the ship should always be berthed in Southampton with the port side to the quay. And we see in a photo of Titanic, this was apparently taken the night before she sailed on her one and only voyage, and you can see that Titanic was docked with the port side to the quay. There was a conspiracy theory published a couple of years back. They were claiming that there was fictitious fire damage on the starboard side of the ship, and that therefore this is why the ship was docked port side to the quay, so that people couldn't see the fire damage. Complete fiction, but of course I think the real reason is that Andrews had recommended it the year before. And you just see here, so the star there is marking out, it might be a bit hard to read, that's the reciprocating engine casing, and if you just look above the star, there is a passageway and a door at the side of the ship, and it was just provided to to help access the engine room rather than have to go through all the other areas. And you can see down towards the bottom, so that's the starboard side of the ship, you can see there are just staterooms there, so there wasn't a way to get that access. So Andrews was basically thinking of the practicalities, just about working the ship and making things easier. He was also concerned about passenger safety, so he made a recommendation that when Olympic was docking or undocking, the third class passengers shouldn't be allowed on the poop or the forecastle decks, because he said if a rope is carried away, someone would be sure to be killed. And this is a photo of Olympic's poop deck. I think it was taken a bit later than 1911. Based on Andrew's recommendation, the scenes you see in the Cameron film are probably not too true to life, because based on what Andrews had said, third-class passengers weren't going to be allowed in that area. And Andrew's recommendations, they ranged quite widely. You know, he was a employee of Harland & Wolff, his was a shipbuilder's perspective, but he was also making recommendations about the day-to-day operation of the ship. White Star sailed from Liverpool, of course, as well as Southampton and other ports, and Andrew said that in Liverpool, the pilot is always on the aft docking bridge, and he thought that this should be carried out in Southampton as well. He also had a recommendation. You can just see at the stern of the ship, it's a bit hard to read here, the quality of the photo, but there was a warning notice board, and it said, notice, this vessel has triple screws, keep clear of the blades. You might think it was self-evident. And he suggested, just as a practical matter, you know, we need to fit these boards there permanently, because the original design, they were putting the boards there, taking them away, fitting them back when the ship left or when the ship arrived, which was just damaging the boards, and it was a bit ridiculous, really. But Olympic had a successful main voyage in June 1911. She carried over 1,300 passengers, through almost 500 in first class. Andrews wrote home in a letter after Olympic had arrived in New York that she'd actually made a record for speed. Now this was a record for speed in terms of the White Star line. It wasn't the fastest ship in the world. She had no hope of matching the record holder Mauritania. Nonetheless, she averaged 21.43 knots. And unfortunately at the time there was an error of 100 minutes in the voyage time as reported. So the time that was reported was wrong, and the average speed was understated. It was said she'd averaged 21.17 knots, and this error wasn't discovered until some years later. And another pleasing factor with Olympic was that coal consumption was about 620 tonnes of coal every day. It was much less than originally considered, so that was good from a ship owner's point of view. This is Olympic arriving in New York in June 1911, and of course she was the only one of the three Olympic-class ships to reach New York. And you can see here she's assisted by a number of tugboats. One of them was the O.L. Hallenbeck, and unfortunately it was in collision with Olympic's starboard propeller. And the tug seems to have come off worse, and the tug was seriously damaged. It sort of limped away for repairs. Propeller only slightly distorted one of the blades. And the tug's owner, Peter Cahill, waited until April 1912 until Titanic had sank, and that was when he filed his legal action against White Star, so maybe kicking someone when they're down. And that's where these warning notice boards come in. Part of White Star's response was that, well, we have a warning sign on the ship that says keep clear of the blades, and pointed out it was 6-inch lettering. And the case went through the courts. In the end, blame was assigned 100% to the tug. It wasn't deemed to be the fault of Olympic. Nonetheless, you sometimes read some Titanic histories, and they cite this as an example, a criticism of Captain Smith. But in reality, it wasn't Olympic that was held to blame. And even if it had been, she was under a pilot's control in any case. Of course, these ships were very luxurious. This is the famous grand staircase of Olympic, and this was taken in later years. They've added some additional handrails there just for passengers to hold on to where needed. This is a posed publicity photo with ladies and gentlemen in their dinner attire, and it's not the best photo. We've only got this from a brochure. We haven't got the original negative, to my knowledge. But if you look closely at the clock at the top of the stairs, I mean, it looks to me like it's 10 to 3. So again, that wouldn't be dinner time. I guess they were. I guess they made this photo in the afternoon, and they were doing various shoots for publicity purposes. This staircase descended a number of decks in first class, and one of the things that Holland and Wolff had done was fit a hat and cloak room for first class passengers. And Andrews looked at this and he said, well, it's not really used enough, and it's taking up a lot of space. So he made a suggestion that cloak room, which you can just see here at the top, the black arrow, be got rid of and replaced with first class staterooms. So again, he's giving advice, not just from a shipbuilding perspective, but I suppose from a commercial perspective for the White Star Line. You can use this space for extra passengers. You know, you can earn more money. And he had an alternative plan to put some hooks for hats and coats elsewhere on D-deck. And then you can just see here a later plan, just comparing it. So on the right, at the top, you know, they fitted in 4 first-class staterooms, which seem to have been added late in 1911. And at the time, competition was intense for passengers. One of the things that was in much demand was privacy. So in particular, single berth first-class staterooms were popular. The Holland America line had completed Rotterdam in 1908, and she was on the New York route and competing for continental traffic, and she had 87 single berth staterooms which were in much demand, and by the time Olympic was completed they just had almost 100, and of course these extra staterooms just added to that and made the ship more competitive. Of course, one of the innovations on Olympic and her sisters was the first class reception room. So this was where passengers could relax before and after dinner. It didn't change too much over the years. This is a photo of Olympics, again a publicity photo in the 1920s. And you can just see some of the furnishings. It was just a light, airy room. It proved very popular, and some of the various furnishings there was a Dutch connection. There was a Dutch firm, Mutters and Zoon, who supplied much of the furniture. And what Andrews noted, he came up with some ideas to improve the service in the first class dining saloon. So there were some serving doors, and he said, well, actually we don't need those, so he suggested getting rid of them and you could have more table space. Andrews noted, well, the first class reception room is the most popular room in first class. It's crowded after lunch and dinner, also for afternoon tea. He pointed out that it was so crowded they found it necessary to bring all these spare chairs in from the baggage room just to provide temporary seating accommodation, and he ordered more furniture to be put there. They also allowed smoking, and of course with the number of people I guess there was too much smoke, so he said an exhaust fan needed to be fitted there. And we know from other observers as well, this room was so popular you even had first class passengers on the grand staircase because there just wasn't anywhere to sit or anywhere to stand. And this was something that was copied by the Cunard line when they designed Aquitania. But of course, Andrews was not just looking at the passenger accommodation, he was also talking to the ship's crew and seeing, well, what would work better in terms of the operation of the ship. He spoke to Captain Smith, and Captain Smith recommended these protective windows with the round bullseye lights. So you can just see there in the photo, you've got the main navigating bridge shelter. You can see the rectangular windows, and just beneath that you've got these with the circular lights, and they were there for protection. And it's a bit unclear because the way Andrews had written it sounded like those were not there when the ship was completed, and yet this seems to have been a fairly standard piece of equipment on other liners such as Adriatic. Bill Sorder has suggested that maybe these shutters were available on Olympic, but perhaps they were stored somewhere else temporarily, and maybe in stormy conditions actually it's just better to have them already there on the bridge, and you can place them there on the windows as needed. The bridge was very high above the waterline, but the North Atlantic in winter, it really is a hostile ocean, and there are numerous reports over the years of these huge waves striking ships. In the mid-1920s, for example, some of Olympic's bridge windows were broken. It's a case of Majestic in the 1930s, and there was a wave which basically smashed in her bridge windows, hurt the captain. He had to go to hospital, and if I remember rightly, he then retired and returned on Olympic from New York as a passenger. And there were some oddities just in the design process. So Captain Smith had his own quarters just behind the bridge. He had his own sitting room. For some reason, they provided linoleum tiles in the sitting room as well as a carpet. Well, why? You really don't need that. So Andrew said, well, you don't need to fit linoleum tiles. And presumably on Titanic, those tiles were not fitted. Don't know one way or the other, but that's what Andrew's recommendation suggests. There was an omission, some of the private bathrooms, so this is of course first class passengers only, and even then it's only a minority of first class, but they had private bathrooms, and some of these bathrooms they'd forgot to put sponge holders there. So we recommended that these be fitted, just a little detail for passenger comfort. And he also noted that some cigarette holders had not been fitted in the first and second class gentlemen's water closets. So, if you need somewhere to put your cigarette while you're using the facilities. Some of Andrew's recommendations, they also shed light on conditions at sea at the time. So if we go back to the early 1900s, the majority of third-class steerage passengers to the United States were accommodated in what we would call the old-type steerage. So these were passenger vessels. They had these huge open dormitories, so you could have more than 100 people. Really not nice. Just in terms of ventilation, in terms of privacy. You could possibly have someone just snoring really loudly, and it probably disturbs everyone. They really weren't well looked after. Almost human cattle, really. And the United States government sent an immigration commission agent on a number of ships in the early 1900s, so this was 1908, 1909. And her report was quite interesting, that they did things like they cleaned the bathroom facilities just before the ship reached the United States. And then, of course, the authorities came on board and, there's a nice clean bathroom. It hadn't been like that earlier in the voyage. And conditions really were quite poor for third-class women in particular. So this agent wrote, some of the stewards were quite strict in driving men out of the women's quarters, but one steward harassed the female passengers himself. Not one day passed without him causing some annoyance. And on another occasion, it was the chief third-class steward who was taking liberties and was harassing the female passengers. And she wrote that, I cannot say that any woman lost her virtue on this passage, but in making free with the women, the men of the crew went as far as possible without exposing themselves to the danger of punishment. But this limit is no doubt frequently overstepped. Several of the crewmen told me that many of them marry girls from the steerage. When I insinuated that they could scarcely become well enough acquainted to marry, the answer was that the acquaintance had gone so far already that marriage was imperative. So these were the conditions for the majority of third-class passengers at the turn of the century. White Star and the European lines went to great pains to improve third-class facilities. If we look at Olympic, of course, they practically eliminated these open dormitories. And the practice on board White Star ships, such as Olympic, was that in terms of the third-class passengers, they made sure that the men were in the third-class accommodation at the bow, and they tried to keep them separate from women and families who were mostly berthed at the stern. What Andrews recommended was that slip bolts should be fitted on the inside of the third-class stateroom doors, and his reason for this was that this would protect women who occupied those staterooms. And this is an extract. It's an April 1911 plan of Olympic for third class. This is aft on E deck. And you can see actually a number of these cabins are actually two berth. So there are typically 2, 4, 6 berth rooms on Olympic, and as well as the cabin numbers. So just as an example, if you look at the left, you see 126. So that's the number of the stateroom, and then you've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. And those are the numbers of the berths, and the odd numbers are the lower berths. So that just distinguishes which berth is which. But you can see here, it's just one of those many details that might go unnoticed, and we wouldn't necessarily have known about it if we didn't have Andrew's notes. But he was clearly thinking there about how can I improve the lot of the third class passengers. Now, when Olympic entered service in 1911, one of the features she had on board was a photographer's dark room, and there are some accounts that there was a photographer's dark room on Titanic. In the original design, yes, but there wasn't as completed. What Andrews noted was that the dark room on Olympic was not used particularly. So he suggested that the White Star Line carried a photographer on board, and he said, well, they could then sell photographs to passengers and also help develop film and so on. They don't seem to have taken up that suggestion, but it did mark a change compared to a couple of years earlier, because Adriatic was completed in 1907. She was the previous White Star flagship. And they'd specifically advertised as one of her features that there was a photographer's dark room on board. And of course, they said no charge is made, but passengers are expected to bring their own materials and their equipment. And I guess maybe that's a reason that the dark room on Olympic wasn't used so much. And so if you don't bring your materials with you. Right, so another of Andrew's recommendations was apparently when Olympic was completed, they didn't have permanent lettering of the various decks in second class. So that was one of his recommendations, that they had deck letters there so people could keep track of where they were. This, of course, is an illustration of Britannic. You can tell by the completely different design or arrangement of the lifeboats. But what was the same on Britannic as well, just where that blue arrow is, was the main second-class staircase. So it ran all the way from the boat deck down to F deck, and you know, you can just see the benefit of knowing which deck you're on. It probably seemed, especially if you're going up, it probably seemed like it went on forever. And second-class passengers only have one elevator or lift, but it was very well used, whereas the first-class passenger lifts didn't seem to be as popular. Now, of course, Olympic and her sisters were designed for comfort and luxury rather than speed. Nonetheless, they needed very powerful propelling machinery just to keep up a competitive speed, and they were designed for 21 knots with plenty of power in reserve. One of the pleasing things about Olympic was on her maiden voyage there was no excessive vibration. She was generally a pretty smooth, pretty comfortable ship. Nonetheless, all ships can be improved to a point, and Andrews was on board, and he had some sort of measuring instrument to gauge the amplitude and the frequency of the vibration. But what he did write was that there was no excessive vibration during the maiden voyage. But just gained that experience that when the engines were running at a particular speed, particular number of revolutions, you could just feel this this pulsation motion. You know, I think that would have been something the ship's engineering staff took on board. I guess you just try and avoid running the engines at those particular revolutions. You can just see here some of the scale of Olympic. Of course, this is many years later. Nonetheless, you can see the huge propellers, and this is when she's in the floating dock at Southampton. So the dock's actually been raised, so you can just see the scale there. It's really impressive engineering. And of course, for all these big issues, there were some minor matters that someone such as Andrews had to attend to. There was a meeting on 6th of February 1912 of the Hand and Wolf managing directors, there were some concerns there. They said that incidentally to the completion of number 401, so that's Titanic, it was arranged that the managing directors should consider what was the best course to adopt to prevent the idling of the men on board the steamer, which has become very marked. And they were going to meet again on Friday the 9th to further discuss it. So it seemed to be worrying that the workers weren't really working as they should have been. But there was another very important question that came up, and that was, you can just see at the bottom here, question of improving the staff dining room menu. And this was left to the chairman and Mr. Andrews to deal with. And it's annoying because there's no further detail. I don't know what was wrong with the staff dining room menu, you know, maybe, or exactly how it needed to be improved, and don't really know what the solution was, or whether Thomas Andrews had been able to deal with it before Titanic sailed. But it seems to have been past quite a few things to deal with over the years. And of course, if we fast forward to end of March and then early April 1912, Lord Pirrie was unable to attend, but Holland and Wolff had completed the Belfast Steamship Company's Patriotic, so this was a cross-channel Liverpool steamer, and Andrews attended a celebration on behalf of Holland and Wolff instead of Lord Pirrie. And he was very optimistic in his comments, so, you know, prosperity of Holland and Wolff was never greater. You know, he was commenting that Holland and Wolff were expanding in other cities. He reassured them, we will always have our headquarters in Belfast. And again, he pointed out that over 15,000 men employed at Holland and Wolff's works, and wage bill had reached over £27,000. And yeah, he highlighted two first-class passenger ships, so the Patriotic and the Titanic. And of course, early in April 1912, Titanic went on trials. Trials were successful, and she sailed for Southampton and was prepared for her own maiden voyage. And it was a bit of a rush. Olympic was at Southampton, I think it was 10 days or so the previous year, before she sailed on a maiden voyage. Titanic, they had a bit less than a week after she arrived in Southampton to get the ship ready. And by all accounts, Andrews was busy throughout that whole period. He wrote a letter talking about problems with the restaurant galley hot press. He'd come up with a design to reduce the number of screws in the stateroom hat hooks, so presumably thought it was wasteful using so many screws, or that they weren't needed. There was another problem on Titanic. She had a feature that Olympic didn't have, and that was the first-class suites on B deck were expanded. And in particular, there were two parlour suites on B deck, which had their own private promenade deck. So this was the first private promenade deck, well, decks to go to sea. Andrews had obviously been discussing with the White Star line, but he thought that pebble dashing on the private promenade decks was too dark. So he commented on that, and also was talking about staining the furniture green. So again, just all these little minute details that he's busying himself with. And you just get the impression that he was a perfectionist. You know, all of this work, he was doing what he could to make the ship as perfect as it's possible to be. And I suspect that Andrews was making very similar notes to what he'd done on Olympic the year before, on Titanic's maiden voyage. Of course, we'll never see those if he was, because they were lost with him, lost with the ship. We know from the testimony of J. Bruce Ismay, who was White Star's chairman and managing director, that Andrews had submitted a plan to reduce the size of the reading and writing room. So this was a room in first class, mostly ladies that it was intended for, and he thought the room was just too large. It was almost like an L shape, so there was an alcove that just wasn't needed in Andrew's opinion, and he had an idea to put staterooms there instead, so again you could earn more revenue from first class passengers. So again, he's got that eye on the commercial benefit of doing that. And Andrews had a first class stateroom. It was A36 at the aft grand staircase on the promenade deck. We know from the testimony of his steward, Etches, that Andrews was busy the whole time, and Etches testified he was making notes of improvement. The whole of the day he was working from one part of the ship to the other. And he also said Andrews was very late in going to bed. Now, there are accounts from Belfast that Andrews was sometimes appearing at the shipyard sort of 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. So if he was going to bed late as well, I wonder if he was one of those people, you know, that seem to function on just a couple of hours sleep a night. So I'm quite jealous of those people, because it would just be nice to, you know, have all that extra time. And really, I think it's entirely possible that Andrews was still up and awake when he would have felt the engine stop and an ominous vibration when Titanic collided with the iceberg. So it was 11:40, of course, on the 14th of April. We know that Andrews was seen going below to inspect the damage, and that was apparently on his own initiative. There's an American researcher, George Behe, who's put together a lot of survivor accounts mentioning Captain Smith, Thomas Andrews, where they were seen and when, after the collision. There was an eyewitness who described Andrews saying to the captain, 3 have gone already, and he's presumably referring to the watertight compartments, and they're already aware that the 3 forward holds were flooding. And then Captain Smith went up to the bridge. Short time afterwards, Andrews was seen coming back, and it appears that he was then had been made aware of, or had seen that boiler room 6 was flooding. And of course, when Andrews knew that, then he knew not just that the ship was seriously damaged, but that the ship was going to sink. And he was seen shortly afterwards going up the grand staircase. There was a couple of first-class passengers who saw him, but one, Mrs. Warren, said that he had a look of terror on his face, and he was going up the staircase quickly, a couple of steps at a time. Unfortunately, by that point, what had promised to be another successful maiden voyage, one of many, and another triumph for Hand and Wolf and the White Star line, had turned into what would be one of the worst maritime disasters in peacetime ever. And by that point, Andrew's notes really were irrelevant. His popular account of his final moments is that he was seen in the first-class smoking room. Actually, a number of researchers have looked at that, and the steward who saw him there earlier in the evening, and we know this because the steward got off in a particular lifeboat, and we know when the boat left. And it appears actually that the last sighting of Andrews was near the bridge, the forward end of the boat deck, and he was there with Captain Smith. The water had finally reached them, and there was a comment, "We can't wait anymore," and they both went into the sea and were among the many victims of Titanic. And really, for both Andrews and Hand and Wolf, of course, Titanic was a huge human tragedy, but they did all of this work, all this engineering, all this that they accomplished with all these other ships. People don't remember the successes; you're remembered for the disaster. And unfortunately, that was Andrews, only 39, and he lost his life. Okay.